Good evening. I'm Sandra Serini-Elzer, Chair of the Advocacy Committee of the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw and Liaison to the League of Women Voters of Michigan Statewide Environmental Network. Since this is a public presentation, I wanted to remind everyone that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. The League works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, such as making sure we all have the life-giving resource of clean water. The League also works to influence public policy through education and advocacy, and supports measures that will protect our water quality, reduce water pollution, and protect our lakes, streams, and wetlands. To further our education goal, I'm very pleased that David Allen has agreed to speak with us this evening about his decades-long work using the EPA Superfund law to force paper companies to spend billions of dollars to clean up their toxic sediment in the Fox River and Green Bay. David is a wildlife biologist who lives in Marquette, Michigan, and who has worked with federal, state, tribal, and local governments for over 25 years. In over 25 states. He's also a former member of the board of directors of our own League of Women Voters of Michigan. David is the co-author of the book Paper Valley. The book is a fascinating story of how the federal Superfund law forced paper companies to clean up toxic sediment in the Fox River and Green Bay. As you may know, the Fox River and Green Bay empty right into Lake Michigan, so the toxic contamination was spreading to all of our Great Lakes. David plans to focus on how Michigan can use a Superfund law and other laws to help clean up toxic pollution in Michigan. So with that, I'm happy to turn the program over to David Allen. David?
Thanks a lot, Sandra. I really appreciate that. This is a great opportunity for me because this is an intersection of two of the most important parts of my life, and certainly an intersection of the two most impressive teams I've ever been part of. One was my team on this cleanup that we've been talking about briefly, and the other is the League of Women Voters, where I've served on both of my local board and the state board. Both teams are tremendously important with tremendously talented people, and I'm just delighted to have a chance to bring these two worlds together. So tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time sort of orienting us to the site that I'm going to be talking about where this cleanup took place. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this book that Susan Campbell and I wrote, which is sort of about one of the decades in a 7-decade-long endeavor. So the 7 decades are from 1953, when PCBs first started entering the Fox River from paper mills. 2023, this year, is the year when the cleanup agencies officially closed the sites at the site at the end of the Superfund project. So that 70 years is sort of this PCB story. The 1990s is mostly about where the book focuses. And the way I'm going to try to give you a sense of the book is I've got a few slides that are going to go with a recording, a radio interview we did with Milwaukee Public Radio, which does a really quick job. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it okay. There might be a little bit of boominess, but hopefully you'll be able to hear it okay. And then I want to turn my attention and I'll also have I'm going to break up that recording with a couple of readings from the book that I think are especially of interest to League members, League of Women Voters members. And then I'll spend some time talking about why this is important for Michigan. So with that, I'm going to get started with the slideshow. Let's see here. There we go. So the first thing I want to say is that we're talking about this large site in northeast Wisconsin, but I want to draw your attention to this gray line, which is running between the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Wisconsin up here, and goes right through the middle of the bay and out into Michigan. That is the border between Michigan and Wisconsin. And you'll notice that about half those waters of Green Bay, the Bay of Green Bay, are Michigan waters. So this has always been a Michigan story as well as a Wisconsin story. And in fact, Michigan was the first state to join the governmental agencies working on this as a co-trustee, even before Wisconsin did. And Michigan has fought for restoration projects that have taken place in Michigan. So this is very much a a Michigan story, even though the cleanup itself took place in Green Bay. The fact that the cleanup took place in Wisconsin, so that now you can see this is the actual lower Fox River between Lake Winnebago and the Bay of Green Bay. And although the cleanup took place all in Wisconsin, the primary justification for that cleanup was risk to human health and the environment throughout the Bay of Green Bay. So without the effects that were taking place throughout Green Bay, it probably would not have been possible to leverage the gigantic cleanup that took place here. So again, that Michigan is a very big part of the justification for the cleanup that took place in Wisconsin. And then, of course, when that river gets cleaned up, we're improving all of the bay and, in fact, Lake Michigan, because Fox River is one of the very largest sources of PCBs to the entirety of the lake. Now, this is more of a stylized picture that's a little bit easier to see. This is where the cleanup took place, and you'll notice upstream, the river kind of goes a different direction than you normally think of. It's actually flowing from down here in the southwest at Lake Winnebago, down here, up to Green Bay. So you're going downstream from the lower left to the upper part. And what EPA did, along with Wisconsin DNR, is they broke this site into several operable units under Superfund. And we won't get into a lot of this, but I just wanted to show you this. The operable units allowed them to tackle the cleanup in stages. Most of the PCBs are in this OU4 between the De Pere Dam and Green Bay. So the lion's share, the really big project, the most of that $1 billion took place down here to dredge and cap in this region down here.
In 1992, wildlife biologist David Allen came to Green Bay to orchestrate the removal of chemicals from the Fox River. Journalist Susan Campbell was also in Green Bay, covering the complex story. It took years of negotiation, followed by a 17-year cleanup that cost over $1 billion. But the effort was a success. Now, Allen and Campbell have written a book about it called Paper Valley: The Fight for the Fox River Cleanup. They joined WUWM environmental reporter Susan Benz to talk about it.
In the 1950s, a paper company called NCR invented a new kind of paper called NCR paper. And it's like carbonless copy paper, but without the carbon. So it was a new invention. And the problem is the stuff they used to transfer the ink between the different layers had PCBs in it. And that paper was a high quality paper. And so the trimmings and the rejected sheets got recycled. And the mills on the Fox River learned how to do that recycling. So both the manufacture on the Fox River and the recycling of this paper on the Fox River caused discharges, uncontrolled discharges of the PCBs into the river. And they accumulated in the sediments for decades. And they were still in there all the way until the 90s when Susan and I showed up.
My husband and I were both reporters out in the suburban Philly area. And we both got jobs hired by the Green Bay Press Gazette. Ultimately, the paper decided, they saw the Fox River case was coming and starting to gather steam. And so they actually resurrected the environment beat. They hadn't had it for a little while. They asked me if I would take over, which I was very excited about because I've been trying to angle toward science and health reporting before I'd come to Green Bay. So I leaped at the chance. I just started to cover the story as David had already been gearing up his work there.
Right. So there's this law called the Superfund law, and it's the law that lots of people have heard of where you clean up landfills and things like that. But it also can be used to clean up very big sites like rivers. And in the early 1990s, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided they would partner with Wisconsin, and they did this all over the country and other sites, to do what's called a natural resource damage assessment. It's part of the Superfund law, where you basically figure out, well, what is the public lost? And what can we do both to fix the site and then to make up for the losses over time, the habitats have been lost or the wildlife has been lost or whatever. So my job was really to come work on the fish and wildlife injury part of the case to help Wisconsin build an overall Superfund case that would include both the cleanup and all of their natural resources. And together we would figure out how to do this. And so in 1992, after some good initial conversations with Wisconsin, I got hired, and a couple other people got hired in other states And we dived into this new project to try to figure out what to do. So, with that introduction, I want to now turn to a quick reading, a fairly short reading from the book. And again, I mentioned that the 1990s was this sort of key decade that the book is about. And the reason it's the key decade is because when we started trying to figure out what to do about these PCBs, a bit of a war broke out amongst the different governmental agencies. Basically, the state of Wisconsin, mostly for political reasons, but for some other reasons as well, did not want Superfund to be used and did not want the federal government to be used. And so it took 10 years, to sort of convince everybody to allow the Superfund project to go forward. And this first reading is one of the key moments where we have basically finally, after years of negotiation behind the scenes, convinced the US EPA to join with the rest of the federal government, so with the Department of Justice and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the head of the regional office down in Chicago, a guy named Dave Ulrich, was the one who spearheaded that decision to join as a Superfund site, even though the state didn't want EPA to join. And my leader, that the equivalent to Dave Ulrich, my guy in the regional office was a guy named Bill Hartwig, who basically was key in convincing Dave Ulrich that this really needed to happen. And once Dave Ulrich said, okay, we're going to do this, we realized, well, even someone as high up as Dave Ulrich might not be able to convince the rest of the agency to really follow through. So we wanted to bring in the public, bring in the environmental groups, bring in all of the people, all the scientists, to make sure that they were aware of what was happening and to increase and ramp up the pressure on EPA so they go forward. And that's what this reading is about. And so this is where the Fish and Wildlife Service goes to the Green Bay public to talk about this monumental decision that's been made. The day after, quote, the day after Dave Ulrich announced to his sister federal agencies his intention to list the Fox River as a Superfund site, we marshaled our forces. It was time to take our case directly to the Green Bay public. And it was time to help Dave convince the rest of EPA that there was no turning back, like it or not. The night of May 21st was a comfortable spring evening in downtown Green Bay. More than 100 people gathered in the Brown County Library's large auditorium, waiting for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's first ever public presentation on plans for a massive cleanup and restoration of the Fox River and Bay of Green Bay. DOJ, EPA, DNR, and people from my own field office were all there. Environmental groups, reporters, local academics, and paper reps too. So far, this felt a lot like the minutes before an orchestra concert when I was playing a solo. The key was to connect with the people in the auditorium. The folks who turned out that night wanted and deserved insight, whether it was notes on a sheet of music or technical details. Bill set the stage, then cued me. There was electricity in the air and just enough adrenaline in my body to focus my mind on my audience and my part to play. As I slowly paced the front of the room and looked audience members in the eye, I could feel my life of fieldwork being left behind. I glanced at members of my team as I delivered the points they'd asked me to remember. But I focused on the people I did not know in the room as I hit a crescendo on the central theme that I knew bound me together with my fellow citizens. I said, everywhere you look, you find the paper company's PCBs. In the Fox River, throughout the bay, in every drop of water, there are paper mill PCBs. You can measure paper mill PCBs in the shallow waters of the Cat Island chain near the river, in the deep waters by Washington Island, and in the northern reaches of Big Bay de Noc, 100 miles north of here. Every scoop of sediment, every emerging insect, every fish, and every bird eating our bay's insects or fish has measurable PCBs from the paper mills. It has been this way for decades, and it will be for decades more. It was no shallow sales pitch. This is what most motivated me, and I was passionate about sharing it with the audience. As the presentation ended, I looked back to my team. They were smiling, and people around the room were nodding. Maybe this was more like being the conductor than a soloist. I'd finally engaged with the Green Bay community that night directly. It energized me even more than I'd expected. Maybe I wouldn't miss fieldwork after all.
thinking back to that so long ago, what do you remember learning in those early days?
It was mind-boggling from the start, all the acronyms, RIFS, PCBs, what the heck was all this? I was pretty overwhelmed. I had good teachers in David and also some representatives of EPA and DNR. It was fascinating because I was sitting ringside to the evolving science about PCBs, that we were coming out of the times where people could see and smell and taste pollution in the water and in the air. And here was this invisible contaminant that people were trying to figure out, what does it mean for the community? Is it bad? How bad is it? The one thing that David and people at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ultimately EPA too and DNR knew was that it had to be addressed. It had to either come out of the water or be contained in it somehow.
So it's such a huge story. It's so complicated what was going on in the DNR and our state government and the paper companies. I mean, who wants to pay to clean up, right? But David, can you give an idea of, a snapshot of that complexity?
I would say that there's two different kinds of complexity. The first is administrative, and the second is more scientific. So let me talk about the scientific one first. So PCBs are not one thing. There are 209 specific chemicals, and each of those 209 chemicals do different things when they get inside organisms. And these things last forever, not forever, but for very, very decades and decades. That's why they were designed, so that they would be long lasting. And they bioaccumulate into organisms, and then they cause all these subtle effects, because each of these 209 things interferes with enzyme systems and genetic systems, and you get all kinds of injuries, cancer and reproductive failure and deformities and all sorts of things. Then administratively, it's very complicated because it's really expensive to fix something like this. It turned out to cost $1.3 billion. How do you get $1.3 billion that nobody has planned for to do a project like this? We believed right at the beginning that this was going to require court mandates in order to compel the private sector to pay this much money. And we didn't know exactly how much it was going to be, but we knew it was going to be at least hundreds of millions. And so this set up this very complicated issue between governmental agencies about, should this be a public works project? Should we have Congress fix it? Should this be done as a coalition between the private sector and the public, where everybody contributes equally? Or should this be a legalistic system? And of course, just the fact that it is legalistic means there are people who don't want to do it. And so there was a really big conversation in the late 80s and early 90s about how should we tackle it. And my group said, there's no way we can tackle this without the law. But other groups were saying, no, we can find a way to build a coalition and do this. And so that set up a very long, ended up being a battle, but discussion that turned into a battle about how are we going to try to tackle the project of cleaning it up.
Our then Governor Thompson did not want this to happen. The DNR, the leadership evolved, but George Meyer became the head of the DNR. Give a sense for those dynamics and the tension there.
Sure. So the things I do know are Governor Thompson was a very popular, very powerful, very effective governor, and his political stronghold included the Fox River Valley. And the paper companies, they're smart, and so they realized that they had an opportunity to take advantage of Governor Thompson's predilection not to like the feds, not to like environmental regulation, and they were right in the right spot in one of his strongholds so that they could close ranks with him. They basically got an agreement with the governor to try to control this situation, to not let it get out of hand, especially by the feds. And that's not that unusual. But the thing that happened next is unusual. The leadership of the DNR, one of the best environmental agencies in the country, had been for decades. The leadership decided, for whatever reason, I don't know the reason, that they didn't want to cross the governor. And it's somewhat understandable, right? You don't want to cross the boss. But they went further than just not crossing him. They actually championed what he wanted to have happen, which was keep Superfund out.
In other words, we're going to handle this problem.
We'll handle it. The state's got this. The governor and the DNR will handle this. But the difference of opinion was, we believed that the price tag was going to be that high that there was no way the paper companies would go along with it. If you imagine someone coming to you and saying, can we have $1 billion to do something not related to your business? And you knew you didn't have to do it, and you knew that you could also resist it legally. And so the paper companies prepared for litigation, and the feds prepared for litigation, and the state said, I think we can all get along. when we said, no, we're not going to do it that way, they turned on us. And so we ended up in this very, very difficult interagency battle, basically Beds in the Tribes and Michigan on one side and the state of Wisconsin on the other. And it took 10 years for us to finally come together and start the litigation, which took another 15 years.
So
Now I'm just going to do one more reading, and there'll be one more clip, and then we'll go to the rest of the slides and Q&A. But this next reading, I think, is especially important for League of Women Voters, because what this reading is about is there's a section of the Superfund law that allows agencies to send what's called information requests. It sounds pretty innocuous, but information requests have the force of criminal law behind them. You have to respond. You have to respond fully. You have to respond truthfully, or you go to jail. So we had sent out these information requests to the paper companies to glean all sorts of information from them that we needed for the case. And this section I'm going to read in the book is about what we did to try to level the playing field for the public so that the public would have access to this information nearly as much as the paper companies, and how we tried to disarm a very common company strategy of weaponizing the Freedom of Information Act law, especially at the federal level, but they also do it at the state level. And then also, in fact, to turn the companies against each other more effectively than they had turned the agencies against each other. And this is all really about transparency, something near and dear to the heart of all League members. So here's the reading. The Fox River Group companies responded to our request letters by sending information that included highly sensitive documents about corporate ownership, finances, and PCB measurements the paper mills themselves had taken over the years. But the companies now had a new strategy in mind. They would bury Fish and Wildlife with hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper. To that end, boxes of documents were routinely delivered to the Green Bay office via UPS, FedEx, and US Mail. If I'd been away on travel, I could usually tell by the secretary's sly smiles that a load had arrived even before I found the latest shipment blocking the path to my desk. If I was already at my desk, I discovered the boxes blocking my office door when I tried to leave. P.H. Gladfelter, in particular, sent box after box of documents, and the documents inside every box looked like they'd been deliberately shuffled. Each box held a mishmash of papers with disparate dates, subjects, and sources. I laughed out loud when I noticed Gladfelter's own legalistic numbering schemes in some of the boxes, probably from some earlier litigation. Even these blocks of documents were in haphazard order. Where's the next document? It could be anywhere, but probably in a different box. It was a deliberate mess. Some paper mill reps had ventured far enough into the Green Bay office to see the chaos of the rest of the field office, which might have led them to underestimate my team. Plus, it was probably obvious that Fish and Wildlife was way outside its institutional comfort zone when identifying responsible parties and sending information requests under the Superfund law. Given all this, the paper companies might well have been counting on my local office to drop the ball. I figured this could work to my benefit, reasoning that the companies may have been more lax than they should have been in deciding what information to send and how to obscure damning details. Hence, there might well be jewels in those carefully disorganized boxes, jewels that would lead to sending the companies more pointed and revealing information requests, and jewels that belonged in an expertly organized reading room for others to see. My team was more than up to the task of organizing the documents, making sense of them, and using them effectively. Our secret weapon was Joe Monio, a slim, unassuming man in his 50s. Joe was easy to miss except for his attire, which was somehow attuned to a previous decade, including thick, square, metal-rimmed glasses. He was quietly relentless, almost too meticulous, and very bright. In fact, Joe's awkward, quiet demeanor hid his passions, talents, and humor well. He would have first crack at this puzzle. Joe and I sat next to each other in the highly organized damage assessment office, an island within the disorganized chaos of the surrounding field office. For its part, DOJ had already sent its experts to Green Bay to help set up the reading room, and they regularly advised us how to maximize the room's potential. The reading room would serve a dual purpose. It leveled the playing field for the public, giving the public and press access to most of the information shared between the paper companies and the agencies. And it shielded Fish and Wildlife staff from being inundated with the paper company's formal requests for federal documents. Such weaponizing of the U.S. Freedom of Information Act was a popular strategy companies use to hamstring federal scrutiny. Agency responses to these requests played right into the company's hands, as it diverted massive agency time and effort away from the very work the company sought to slow. My colleagues at Justice taught me how a reading room could not only thwart the strategy, but also take the fun out of it for the paper companies. Come as often as you like, copy everything. I now focus the whole team on the onslaught of paper company documents that threatened to overtake our humble Green Bay office. The company's shuffling and diluting of files had no chance of deterring the team from unearthing useful documents for the liability case and PCB pathway determination. Indeed, it had the opposite effect. I had other strong motives to make sense of these files. I wanted to make it easier for each company to point the finger at the other's liability. The 7 paper companies could save Fish and Wildlife an enormous amount of time and effort by helping to identify PCB release and liability information about one another. The reading room was about to make the Green Bay office a very popular destination. After making an appointment and signing in, anyone could peruse the documents and make copies. Hard copy indexes on the table pointing to every numbered cabinet, numbered drawer, numbered document, and numbered page. An electronic relational database cross-referenced every page number with document categories, dates, page ranges, content summaries, and status under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. Thus, any member of the public could search an electronic listing of every document in the reading room. Soon after the Fox River Group companies finished sending responses to the first round of information requests, attorneys for each company began making appointments to visit the reading room. I gave the first visiting attorney a personal tour. Dressed in an expensive suit, stylish shoes, and fine jewelry, my guest made no effort to hide a smirk as he surveyed the space and feigned admiration for Fish and Wildlife's mahogany cabinets. I played along and asked if he wanted a cup of coffee, apologizing that he might find the odor of dissected lake trout offensive. I was still unlocking cabinets when the attorney opened one of the drawers. He pulled out a folder, looked inside, then visibly straightened and turned to me with a look of incredulity. In an unguarded moment, the lawyer asked, "Are these all copies? Did you bait stamp every page?" "Yes," I deadpanned, then offered breezily, "You should be able to find everything with the index on the table, but I'll be in my office if you need any help." I suppressed my own smile now, as I wondered how much more surprised my guest would be if he knew about the duplicate case files my team was also maintaining in Milwaukee, Washington, and Boulder. In the coming months, multiple law firms would copy every page in the reading room. It wouldn't be long before the companies began turning on each other.
So over that time, Susan, and talk about how the public, how attitudes evolved.
The pathway was through the fish and the people who ate fish that were contaminated with PCBs. Quite a bit of concern about what was happening and where the science was going to lead. The state did have and still does fish advisories for fish throughout the state, and up there in particular it was regarding PCB contamination, among other things. And they had lots of advisories about how to prepare fish and what fish could be eaten and which fish could not be eaten. The concern is that not everybody was paying attention to the fish advisories.
So whose idea was it to write the book?
I was up in Marquette, Michigan, minding my own business, playing music, happy as a clam. And the governments decided to have a reunion for the natural resource damage assessment, the part that I worked on. 2 of my colleagues from the old days, Jim Honenberg from EPA and Ken Stromberg from Fish and Wildlife Service, both went to the reunion. And they both independently called me up the next day, and they were both just flabbergasted. They said, nobody even remembers that there was a conflict. Everyone's just talking about the end of the story, victory. And like, I don't think that everyone's forgotten that we had 10 years of intergovernmental conflict, followed by 20 years of legal conflict before this got greenlighted. Ken Stromberg, who's a very colorful character and a good friend of mine, said, someone's got to write this down. Someone's got to write this down before it's forgotten. I had taken pages of notes, figuring that if my part ever went to trial, someone would call me as a fact witness and it would be heated. And so I took just notes on everything. And so I said, well, Susan, she reported all the stuff and she understood the whole thing. She was the reporter I had talked to the most over the years. So I called her up I emailed her out of the blue 15 years after we had spoken and said, hey, you got any interest in writing a book? And she says,
It took me a moment. I had put that all behind me. The more I thought about it, I thought the story needs to be told. He has a great story to tell. Things that, I hadn't been privy to before, and others who'd followed the story hadn't been privy to before. We're living in a time where sometimes facts are inconvenient. History is inconvenient. Back then, $1 billion, and that was monumental. And to have David Allen saying that, I think this cleanup is going to cost $1 billion it was really incredible. And a lot of people were incredulous. And I was always curious what it was like to be in his shoes, pushing that battle.
Why do you think it's important that this story is out?
We face a lot of intractable environmental issues. We're always being told they're too big, they're too expensive, there's no political will, there's no public support. We're dealing with these major environmental issues on many fronts: climate change, like biodiversity losses, other major cleanups of contaminants and PFAS. And here's a success story. Here's a story where, yes, the cost was going to be astronomical. Yes, there was concern a whole economy might shudder as a result. There was concern about the science and all and a lot of political interference and naysaying, and a lot of foot dragging by corporations. People saying this could never be done, and it was done. At the crux, there was a battle that lit the fire, that basically propelled the success story. And I think that's the story that needs to be told. A lot of people in the public back then and today say, I'm overwhelmed, what can I do? This shows that people have a voice, they can make a noise, and ultimately they can prevail.
Yeah, and so for me, at the end of the day, the reason I stuck with this book and really wanted to get it out there is because I think that ordinary citizens and ordinary civil servants anywhere have the capability of sifting through all the heated disputes and all of the information and all the conflicting opinions, and to make sense of it, follow where the facts lead, and to ignore the bellicose arguments from political ideologues. And I think that it doesn't matter if it's environmental or even something else. So I'm going to turn now to what I think some of the key lessons are for Michigan and for the League of Women Voters. But just one quick shameless plug: if you do read the book and you want to rate it, go to Amazon or Goodreads or both and rate it. I'd love it if you did. Even if you don't like it, do it. So that's my plug. But let me turn now to the lessons for Michigan and the league, because I think this is really what motivated me. Susan and I spent 6 years writing this book, and I don't think either of us ever meant to really do this. Once we got started, we realized that this really might have traction for today, the environmental issues that we face today. And so, the league's environmental League of Michigan Environmental Network is putting this on tonight because there's so many environmental issues that we still face. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, a lot of people don't probably realize this or remember this, but the League of Women Voters was actually involved in this Fox River matter back in the 90s when I was there. The League of Women Voters at Appleton stepped in and spearheaded the saving of a key public meeting where scientists had been invited, and then they got disinvited after political pressure was put on. And the League of Women Voters in Appleton, with some conservation groups and others down in Wisconsin, saved that meeting and kept it going. And this is really when the tide started to change as the public became more and more involved, even as the politics were raging. And then the League of Women Voters was also part of the coalition, along with other environmental groups and conservation groups, that wrote to the U.S. Department of the Interior when they were being pressured not to go forward themselves. So even before we pressured EPA to join, we had trouble with our own parent agency. So Fish and Wildlife Service is part of the Department of the Interior, and the folks in Interior were hesitant about this as well. And so the League was part of that coalition that helped convince Bruce Babbitt, who was at the head of Interior, to go forward with this. And then, I probably held myself, I don't know, many dozens of public meetings while I was working on this case. And League of Women Voter members were always there and always attentive and always had, excellent questions and raised excellent issues. So even on the particulars of this book, the League of Women Voters plays, a vital role along with many others. So even beyond the non-governmental organizations like the League, it was really impossible to pull off this Fox River cleanup, a $1.3 billion project, without uniting a bunch of key constituents. And without every one of these, I'm convinced it would have failed. So first and foremost, you had to have the scientific community. The groundwork for the science at this site was monumental. Decades of research had taken place in Fox River and in Green Bay about the PCB problem and how it affected people and how it affected wildlife, et cetera. And so without that research community, that scientific community, we could not have even started. And of course, we needed the governmental agencies who are authorized under the law to act on behalf of the public. And so even though it was difficult and even though there was hesitance, finally bringing all these agencies together, Wisconsin and Michigan and all the federal agencies and 3 different tribal agencies, bringing that whole coalition of authorized agencies together was key. The press, without Susan Campbell leading the charge for the Green Bay Press Gazette and causing this to become not only a regional story, but a statewide story and even a national story, there would not have been the attention to what was going on. And no one would have paid any attention. We couldn't have explained to enough people what was happening without the press and without huge press interest. And then, as I've mentioned, the general public represented another way through the various non-governmental organizations that they're a part of, was also essential to weigh in at key times to turn the tide so this got done. And then finally, the courts. And, we know that this is still true today, that a lot of this stuff, when you can't reach a compromise, it goes to the courts. Well, the courts are absolutely essential. This thing was litigated for nearly 20 years, including appellate decisions and bench trials. It was a huge deal. Millions of pages of documents went to the court, and the government's basically won that litigation. So without any of these essential elements, I think that we would have failed. So it's important to remember that. Now, I wanted to mention that there are very similar cases here in the state of Michigan. And these are, some of these are done like Fox River and some are recent and some are further back in the past. But this is just to give you a sampling that these same issues take place under Superfund with federal and state agencies and tribal agencies, just like the Fox River case. Kalamazoo River is a big one. In fact, the Kalamazoo River, it's the same paper companies, it's the same source of PCBs, it's the same kind of contamination. It's so similar, in fact, that there were 2 different groups of paper companies that were fighting each other over their responsibility to pay, over allocation. And the ones that liked what the Wisconsin court said tried to get the Kalamazoo River case moved to Wisconsin because they liked how it turned out. And of course, the ones who didn't like it, how it turned out, wanted to stay in Michigan. At the end of the day, it stayed in Michigan. So a very, very similar case right in Michigan. Manistee River is a case right up here where I live on Lake Michigan. Another PCB site. It's another paper company, much smaller, and that was completed successfully before Fox River was done. The Saginaw River and Bay is a huge case, of course, with GM is probably the biggest responsible party. There are others. PCBs is the main contaminant. There are others as well, but that's a big case. Tittabawassee River with Dow, with dioxins and furans. I think that's still a pretty active site. Still a lot going on there. Detroit River, hugely polluted by just too many to count, too many pollutants to count, too many industries to count. But Superfund still plays a role for the Detroit River. And then Kalamazoo River again with the Enbridge oil spill, which isn't technically a Superfund site. It's the Oil Pollution Act, which is the analog for oil. But so that's a fairly recent case that many of you probably know about. So anyways, this book about this was so-called Wisconsin site really parallels a lot of what's going on in Michigan. But even beyond sort of the current Superfund kinds of projects, we know there are other huge contaminant issues that are facing us right now. So PFAS, which is perfluoroalkyl substances, have a lot of parallels to PCBs, except that they're not so obviously, they don't so easily fit under the Superfund law because of their status as hazardous substances. And there's many, many more PFASs than there are PCBs, at least tens of thousands of chemicals, depending on how you count them. Some estimate as many as millions. But they're persistent, they bioaccumulate, and they're toxic at low levels, very much like PCBs. There's a way more kinds of chemicals with different properties, so it's a little bit more difficult to figure it out. Some of the PFASs dissolve easily in water. That's purposeful for some of those chemicals because they're used for fire retardants and surfactants, all sorts of things, which is very different than PCBs. Some of those are much more readily available through the water. And there are more sources and they're harder to fix than PCBs. Now, like PCBs, there are manufacturing plants like DuPont and 3M, and there are big contamination spots there that probably will fit under Superfund. But of course, the way PFASs are used, they're ubiquitous. And so now you can basically measure PFAS in almost any water you care to measure, almost any organism anywhere. So it's a big, big issue, harder to exactly figure out what to do. And I'd also mention, you've probably seen in the news that both 3M and DuPont have some very large sounding settlements. I think 3M's settlement is over 10 billion. I think DuPont's is over 1 billion. So, that's an order of magnitude bigger than the final cleanup at Fox River. But the thing that I want to point out that's similar to Fox River is Fox River had early settlement offers too. We had a very early settlement offer of 10 million that the state jumped all over, and which is part of what caused the big fight between the feds and the state. It sounded like a lot back then. Back in 1992, $10 million sounded like a lot. And but the problem was way bigger than 10 million. It's 1.3 billion as it turned out. Well, the same thing's probably true for PFAS. These settlements, I think these settlements have to do mostly with water supplies, water suppliers. The problem is probably, I've seen estimates as high as 400 billion just for that element. And that doesn't even include the environmental effects on fish and wildlife after they get in the environment. So I would be, people are going to have to pay very close attention to whether or not to accept these kinds of settlements as enough, just like we did on the Fox River. And then completely beyond Superfund, we also know that there are huge pollution problems, not only in Michigan, but certainly Michigan's one of the states that faces all of this. Microplastics is a big deal, and I know that we actually have some local leagues in Michigan that have made plastics a big issue for their local work with their local governments. But microplastics is a huge worldwide problem as well that doesn't easily fit under Superfund. Phosphorus and non-point sources. There's just a book out just this year, Phosphorus P, the devil's element, that is all about phosphorus and non-point sources. It's a huge problem. It's still a problem in Green Bay. It's a problem in a lot of places. Again, probably doesn't, phosphorus isn't a hazardous substance, so it's not going to fit under Superfund. Climate change is something we all know about. Huge worldwide problem that's going to take a huge amount of effort to figure out how to solve it, and it's going to take a lot of money. Habitat loss, invasive species, all big issues. The point I want to make is we need the same kinds of coalitions to tackle these problems that we did for PCBs and Fox River. You've got to have the scientific community. You've got to have the press. You've got to have governmental agencies. You've got to have the courts. You've got to have non-governmental organizations doing their thing, whether it's a conservation group, whether it's an environmental group, whether it's something like the League of Women Voters that focuses more on voting issues. But this is, such a key issue to so many voters that this fits right in the wheelhouse. And so don't think that it can't be done just because it's big. That's what they said about Fox River. These other problems seem too big to handle, but I think we can handle them as well. And so even beyond environmental, election fraud, this is another one of those things that you can actually figure out the amount of election fraud and its effects empirically. And so that's just another kind of empirical question, just like the PCB issue. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, mis and disinformation, gun safety, reproductive rights, healthcare, all these things are hot topic issues that can be solved by paying attention to the facts, paying attention to the scientific principles, paying attention to the law, and building these coalitions to tackle these other kinds of problems. And just like we said in the radio piece, ordinary citizens, ordinary legal women voter members, ordinary civil servants can make a difference. Don't ever think that it doesn't count. These efforts can actually win. And also never forget that facts, principles, details, the law, and vigilance all matter. And so that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to hear comments or answer questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, David. You inspired us all. Well, you inspired me at least.
Good.
I'm tired just listening to you. So we have one question in the chat. Remember, put 2 questions in the chat. 2 questions now. So this one's from Joe Foley. Have you been able to share any of your techniques and processes with agencies working on any of the Michigan PCB cleanup sites?
Well, sure. So, I mean, some of them were parallel. So, I mean, like that Manistee site, Jim Honenberg, who he was on the call tonight, I don't know if he still is. Jim Honenberg was the lead, it's called an on-scene coordinator or remedial project manager. He was the EPA's lead guy for both Manistee and Fox River at the same time. And so there was a huge amount of crossover there. I have, since I left the government, I worked as a consultant for governmental agencies. And so I've worked on the Tittabawassee River case, the oil spill at Enbridge, a little bit on the Saginaw case. And so I have had a lot of opportunities to talk to agencies, now as a client, in those days as a client. And so there has been crossover. And I would say the message has been imperfectly transmitted. A lot of places still fall into the trap of being too tempted by early settlements that don't do enough. And it's sometimes people do get scared off with the tactics that big companies use. And so I would say I'm not satisfied with the amount of information transfer, but there has been the attempt and some success, I think.
Thank you. So this question is from Ellen Link. Is Fox River's cleanliness being maintained? Do you know?
Yeah, so there's a huge monitoring program under Superfund. It's part of the settlements. It's part of that $1.3 billion is the paper companies are responsible to pay for monitoring of water, sediment, and fish. And I can't remember if they're doing birds too, but I know for sure they're doing water, sediments, and fish. And we've already seen very dramatic increases in the speed with which PCBs are dropping in all these places. Now, probably the most important species in the Fox River for anglers is probably walleye, maybe perch, but walleye still have consumption advisories. They're getting very close to the unlimited category. So I think they're now eat no more than once a week in the river. So we're getting there. We still have to go further. I would also say there are other issues besides PCBs for Green Bay, like phosphorus and runoff and, exotic species and other things. And so the work is not done at Green Bay, but I think that so far it's looking pretty good. Like the PCB problem has been contained probably as well as we could have done it.
Thank you. So I don't know, this is from Karen Schmidt. Are fish still being tested actively for PCBs? I think you just answered that, right?
Yes, they are.
Have the levels changed?
Yes, so they've dropped. They were already dropping slowly. The amount of PCBs that were coming out of the pipes peaked in the 1970s. And so when they turned off the pipes, the sediments became the main source. And the sediments were very, very slowly improving, which translates to very slow improvements in fish. I think most of the estimates I saw were over 100 years it would take to reach unlimited consumption. Now that's all been accelerated. And like I said, I think, I don't know how long it's really going to take. The monitoring will tell us the answer. But I know that the fish programs that do the consumption advisories are very hopeful that we'll reach the unlimited advisory state for at least walleye soon, in single digit years instead of centuries.
Okay, thank you. So this is a comment from David Recalbuto. I know that he worked for the Michigan, I can't remember which entity he worked for, David. So he's saying, as a clarification, Superfund did an emergency response at Enbridge, but the state negotiated the cleanup and settlement. That's David's explanation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Right.
Okay. And then here from Christine Bradoff, Waukegan Harbor was another big PCB site. Do you know if there's any parallels to Fox River?
Yeah, Waukegan so that was I think it was Evinrude so they made boat engines, outboard boat engines, and the castings used PCBs, and so a huge amount of PCBs were discharged accidentally in Waukegan. It's a gigantic site. It's one of the very first sites that people tried to tackle, and that might be unfortunate because I think that, and I don't know all the details of how it all turned out, especially recently, so I don't know if it's been reopened. Like Hudson River was settled early, but it got reopened. It was settled in the 70s, but reopened under Superfund. So at Waukegan, I think that they have done some cleanups. They've removed, an enormous amount of PCBs, but I think they've left behind still a pretty big problem. There was the last time that I tuned in. And again, some of that was so early, it might even have been done under Clean Water Act, which is harder to use than, you can do a lot of this under Clean Water Act, but it's a lot harder, a lot less leverage than Superfund. So there are some parallels. I don't think it's as nearly as complete a cleanup. I think the Fox River represents sort of the best that one can do under Superfund. Waukegan is somewhat less than that.
Yeah, I guess, well, I have a question. So we got two big, in my mind, there are two big problems here in Michigan. I'm sure there are more, but one is oil spills, possibly in the Straits of Mackinac, and God forbid if there should be an oil spill there, what law would require cleanup?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So, the history of the laws, at least at the federal level, are the Clean Water Act came out of the chutes first, and then some of the amendments to the Clean Water Act in 1977, the 1977 amendments, are the first time that they introduced this idea of natural resource damage assessments, where states, feds, and tribes can sue over pollution. So that's in addition to all the regulatory parts of the Clean Water Act, for like discharge permits and things like that. Then, because of Love Canal in New York, in late 1980, they passed the Superfund law, the CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And that greatly increased the leverage and the ability to do these cleanups, and actually created the Superfund and created a huge program for EPA to do these cleanups. But then when the Exxon Valdez hit, people realized that Superfund was not a perfect fit for oil spills. And so the Oil Pollution Act got passed after the Exxon Valdez. And the Oil Pollution Act is even more powerful. So for oil spills, I think most agencies tend to want to try to use the Oil Pollution Act because it has so much leverage. There are ways still to use the other statutes, Superfund and the Clean Water Act, but I think that the Oil Pollution Act is probably where, if the straits were contaminated, you'd probably have a huge mobilization of Coast Guard, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife, states, and they would probably use the Oil Pollution Act. And it's a different set of regulations that are promulgated by NOAA, but anyways, probably OPA is where that would be done. And again, one of the purposes of these laws is to increase the risk of private entities that might pollute. And so I think that the hope is that, Enbridge or whoever will be worried enough that they'll actually cooperate to prevent, that oil spill from happening in the first place.
Oh, you should talk to them.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I see one more question before we're going to let you go. This one is again from Karen Schmidt. Do paper mills still make the same cash register paper by the same method?
No. So PCBs the manufacture of PCBs was banned by EPA in the late 1970s. NCR, that invented this technique of using PCBs in carbonless copy paper, actually stopped using PCBs even before the ban occurred. So that I think 1977 is the last year NCR used PCBs in their manufacturing process. And they switched, so they still make carbonless copy paper, but they no longer use PCBs. And I don't know how the new techniques work, and I don't know if there are other problems with those, but PCBs stopped being used. And then of course, the problem is, I mean, there's already the PCBs out in the paper, so the recycling stream continues to bring PCBs to some of the paper companies even now, but much less than in the past.
Okay, great. All right, well, David, this was just excellent. Thank you so much. I think we are, we've got about 2 minutes left, but I think we're going to let you go like earlier. And Priscilla is, Burnham is saying, I read the book and attended an earlier presentation by David and Susan, but I learned more and feel more galvanized each time. So thank you, David. That's a great ending to this. Also, I want to thank Betsy Nisbet and Mary Ellen Hagenar, who were our tech and our host today, and the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw for hosting this presentation. So thank you so much to everybody who came, and thank you so much to David.
And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.